I can hear myself, so I know y'all can hear me.
I don't think, oh yeah, okay.
There we go. We're hot.
All right, we just got the signal, so I think we're good. I was gonna say the bat signal, but it's more like the Myers Park signal from up top that we're good to go. So welcome to our last talkback of this summer. It's September, but it's technically still summer, so I stand in that. I'm like, it's not the end of the season yet. If you have any questions, you can just raise your hand. Carrie is gonna be sitting up front, and then she'll be able to just pop over and grab them for you. So if anything arises in our conversation, she'll be able to help with that. Before we get started, can y'all help me give Reverend Dr. JJ a round of applause one more time? He's so humble that I think he's blushing, so I'm going to call it out just so he knows. So we have a few questions here. Before we get to these, I wanted to ask you to just back up for us a little bit. And I'm wondering if you can define resurrection for us a bit, right? So I know that's a huge, capacious question. Obviously, we can think about it in terms of kind of the literal resurrection of Lazarus. But as we're talking about what does it mean to be, I wrote down a quote from you. You said, the joy in partnering with God in the work of resurrection, right? And so I'm wondering if you can define what resurrection is, and then maybe we can start talking about the joy of partnering with God in that work.
So that is a very loaded question for a very short period of time. Yeah, thank you very much. I think if I had to define resurrection, I would say that it is bringing new life to situations that were seen as, perceived as, understood to be dead. And so that is why I believe that God calls us into partnership with God's self. Because there are so many situations in the world that have been written off as dead. People, their purposes, their plans, their dreams have been written off as dead things. And I believe that God calls us to partner with God in bringing those dead things back to life. And in so doing, we are doing the work of resurrection.
Thank you. That was succinct for such a big question, so kudos to you for that. I'm going to pick at that just for a little bit longer. Okay. And I'm wondering, as we think about bringing back to life things that are dead, can you give us some examples of things that maybe have been written off as dead in 2023 that we could begin to do the work of resurrection around?
Ooh. That's going to take a moment to think about. I think when you phrase the question that way, I think that there are some things that are not dead but are actively killing us, that God is calling us to oppose, right? So for me, because of my social location in life, particularly as a disabled person, right, we should be working to kill ableism. And the ways in which ableism causes folks to not be included in community or forces them to continue to live at the margins. Heterosexism, patriarchy, racism, all of the isms and things that we should be partnering with God and bringing God's shalom to the world, right? That kind of peace that allows people to live in the fullness of who they are. So that is not necessarily doing the work of resurrection, but it helps us so that resurrection is not necessary because we are not dying at the hands of those isms.
Yeah, so you kind of answered it in the opposite way. What keeps us alive to do the work of resurrection? That kind of gets us at one of our first questions from the audience, and feel free to definitely pass your questions along to Carrie. This person says, what are ways that the road to liberation can be messy, right? So A sub question they have on here is, what's that stench that we're afraid of? So you talked about the part of resurrection that's messy, that literally smells, right? They're asking if you could go a bit more into that process of the messiness.
Absolutely. I think the work of resurrection calls us to messy places. And so if we are used to being in church in the Myers Park neighborhood, right? Eating and frequenting areas that are in the Myers Park area. And yet we don't see anybody who is outwardly suffering, right? So that's not to say that suffering is not happening behind the doors of folks who live in Myers Park. But there are folks who we know are actively suffering as we make our way into Myers Park. And because Myers Park is our destination, we'd rather not stop there because it's messy, it smells. Why would I do that? It's inconvenient. It's gonna take too much of my time. God forbid I get to know the person on the side of the road who needs my help. Then I can't just give them change and drive away, because now I know them. And so I can't go to sleep without thinking about, what are the systems at play that cause them to be there? So that's the messiness of resurrection, the stench that we don't want to deal with. It's much easier for us to say, God bless them, open a way for them to not be on the corner, rather than trying to find a way to build relationship with them so that we can do like Jesus did and call them by name, as Jesus did Lazarus, so that he could experience new life.
I think what's so important about what you're saying, and you really got at this in your sermon, right, is that resurrection is communal, and the process that it takes to be with other folks. And you started to get at this with your answer just now, but in that communal process, it could be uncomfortable for us, and often is, and I would say should be, right? That if we're doing this work and we're a little bit too comfortable, then maybe that's a barometer of where we should be going as it pertains to liberation. Which just leads me to the second part of the person's question. They say, in the work of justice, so many are hurt, right? So many are dealing with pain that reemerges as we do this work, right? So they're talking about the folks that we're becoming a part of community with, but then ourselves. And how do we deal with the pain that is so great, right? So that we don't isolate ourselves as we're trying to do the work of resurrection. So twofold, right? How do we deal with our own pain in this process, our own uncomfortableness, but then also how do we show up for other folks' pain in that process so that we can continue to do the work of resurrection?
I like this question because I think Jesus gives us an example of what it is to know other people's pain and not run away from it, right? So I didn't go into this in detail in the sermon, but I have a sneaky suspicion that Jesus wept because he was familiar with that pain, right? He had his own pain, and experiencing that pain did not scare him away from doing the messy work of resurrection. And so I think in order to do this work, we have to be honest and say that there are going to be some times that it doesn't feel good. It's going to cause us to weep, and we're not weeping out of a place of compassion, but weeping out of a place of, God, how could this situation even exist? And how could I have let it happen in my own backyard? Maybe that is compassion, but I think being open to that pain is what drives us to do the work of resurrection, right? And it is what makes us more effective at the work of resurrection, because we can see others in pain and know that it is causing us pain. And so that puts us not on a level playing field, but it allows me to see empathetically what the other person is going through.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm wondering if you can dive deeper into that. So you said something about it puts us in a place to feel their pain as well and do that work. But we know, right, that the way systems work, the way privilege works, right, is that it is predicated on not knowing what you don't know, right? It is predicated on, I don't have that lived experience, therefore I don't understand that pain, and therefore I don't feel a need to do anything about it because it does not resonate with me on an in-body level, right? And knowing that so much of our congregation, at least in person, is located in Myers Park, how do we get past that not knowing stage to get to a place of still caring to do the work?
I think you ended the question with my answer, that we have to commit to doing the work. It is, I want to be careful with how I say this, but also honest. I think one of the things that is a downside to liberal spaces, progressive leaning, theological spaces, is the idea that we have all of the language right. So we can talk about being anti-racist, we can talk about being anti-ableist, we can make space for those who are LGBTQIA+, we can even elevate black voices in predominantly white spaces and believe that we are doing the work because we have checked off those boxes. But those boxes take nuance, right? And so it is much more than being able to check off the box of we know what it means to be anti-racist, or at least say that we are anti-racist or anti-ableist or anti-whatever, right? Naming that work takes time and requires us to sit with our own discomfort is a part of what it takes, right? So this is not to say that book clubs are not great, but our work can't end with reading a book and saying, oh, well, I'm an anti-racist because I read a book on anti-racism. No, what are you doing to upend racism in your own sphere of influence? Have you thought about reparations to people of color, namely black folks, in your own sphere of influence? Have you thought about supporting people who identify as LGBTQIA+, when every other system in the world says that they don't deserve to be where they are, or we are not allowed to show up in a space as our full selves? What are you doing to create space for them to show up, for us to show up as our full selves? What does it look like for you to do that work individually?
That's juicy stuff, right? Because we're talking systematic macro and bringing it down to our interpersonal micro levels. Before I continue, I wanted to just check the audience and see were there any other questions, comments, concerns. Carrie got one right there. If you want to hold it up real quick, Carrie will come grab it for you. If there's any other questions, comments, concerns, soliloquies, anyone want to throw out a poem? If there's any other ones, feel free. Carrie will do that labor for us. This person, actually picking up on exactly what you kind of just mentioned, says, what would reparations look like, right? And asking specifically to help Myers as a congregation and community to think about that, because obviously the first answer right, is money, right? But I think that often the conversation about reparations kind of gets stuck at that capitalist idea. So can you help us think about what reparations could look like in a capacious, idea?
I will just echo what you just said. I think the thought that many of us think about when we think about reparations, we are thinking about money. And money is good. I mean,
money is great.
Yes.
Start there.
The
Definitely
Bible says that
there.
money answers all things, right? So even Scripture tells us that money can do things that we cannot do. But I do not think that money is the end-all, be-all to reparations, right? So reparations for me would look like, within a corporate setting, or maybe not even a corporate setting, a faith-based setting, thinking about the ways policies and procedures are problematic for people of color or those who are disenfranchised, right? Enacting policies and procedures that make space for grace. That is reparations. Because if we're honest, I'll use myself as an example here. We live in the city of Charlotte. The city of Charlotte is horrible when it comes to navigating the city as a person with a disability, right? Transportation-wise, just it's not there. So what does it look like to use one's personal power to close the gap for a person who is struggling to make it around the city, right? In the same way, what does it look like for a person of color who may identify as LGBTQIA+, to have resources given to them that they otherwise would not have access to? But you know that on a personal level, like if I was able to write a check or make space for them in this way, it would make their life so much easier. That's what reparation looks like. Reparation is honoring and naming the fact that I, as a person who is not a person of color, namely a person who is not Black, have benefited from systems and structures that allowed the people who look like this person, or maybe even this person's family, for me to benefit and not them, right? So how do I right that wrong?
Yeah, so you correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying, think about it on this everyday level of how systems benefit people and then try to act in opposite of that,
Absolutely.
right? I know you and I have talked about, small things like keeping, loose change in terms of bills, right, in your car. And then, having a budget each week of I'm going to give this much to those in need, right? Or I'm going to donate this much time in terms of volunteer hours each month, and kind of setting those standards for yourself, for your household, for your community, and then just acting upon them with consistency, right? Reparations can look a lot of different ways. Any other questions really quickly? I see some faces, I see some rumination, so I want to make sure we don't bypass anyone before I get to our last question, if there's any other thoughts. Yeah? Okay. I'm gonna repeat it. I'm gonna repeat it. She's gonna say it, and then I'm gonna repeat it. It's okay. That's so good. Thank you. So what she said was, going back to the sermon, thinking about the literal stone in front of the tomb, right? And asking, what are some of the stones that we face in our daily life that maybe we don't even recognize, right? And how can we start to recognize those stones and then begin to move them away? Thank you so much for that. That's a great question.
I would say the biggest stone that comes to mind for me is a stone that I think is rampant in the church writ large. The stone of individualism. To reduce the work of God to me, myself, and I places people in caves and in graves, in tombs, where God never intended for them to be. But because I'm looking out for myself, I'm not necessarily thinking about the tombs that everybody else may be in. And for some of us, situationally, like to be isolated and think about me, myself, and I makes sense momentarily, but there are some of us who perpetually live in the state of me, myself, and I.
And I think white supremacy causes that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say all of these isms kind of build off of one another, right? White supremacy stems from the idea that I have to look out for myself and my bloodline and my people, and the world would be less than if we were not around. And so there's this idea that we just got to keep it going, and that all goes back to this individualistic approach to even faith. So we'll come to church and we'll get angry when a particular element of worship doesn't connect with us personally, not realizing that we worship in community. And so what a piece of service that may not be for you may have landed completely different for somebody else. It may be life-giving for them, but because it rubs you the wrong way, we need to get rid of it. So I think the sin and the lens of individualism is one of the biggest stones that we got to deal with.
And then can you keep going to the second part of her question? Now that we can recognize kind of individualism, the way that it causes us, like you said, to think about ourselves, what do we start to do about that? Because we live in a world where if you don't take care of yourself, we unfortunately don't have a lot of security nets, right? Yeah. Going back to those isms, like if I don't go to work, I do not eat, right? And so how do we kind of rebuke that mindset that forces us, coerces us, right, into persistation, right? And so wondering if you can speak on that.
I think, so this is gonna sound very pie in the sky-ish. And I really don't intend for it to be that. I think reminding ourselves that we were never meant to live alone is what is important. So it goes back to the same thing that I'm talking about. God intended for us to be in community. I mean, if we look at the creation narrative, I have a whole lot of feelings about creation narratives, but when God creates humankind, God says it is not good for man, in this instance, to be alone. And so God creates a partner for Adam to be with, so that Adam is not alone. And yet we have pushed against this. At the core of what it meant to be human creation, it was to be in partnership with one another, right? And yet we have gone in the opposite direction of that for so long. And so I think in order to fight that, we've got to remind ourselves and find ways to remind others that we were never intended to be alone in this work.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. If there's no other questions, again, I see some head nods, so that might just be agreement. Is there a question? Okay, Carrie, we got one more question. I'm gonna hand you the mic.
Where did you grow up, and who makes up your family members?
Is that all? I didn't know if you were going to ask me anything else. I didn't want to cut you off. So
I was asking where did you grow up, and who are your family members?
So thank you for asking that question. Part of my family is over here in the sanctuary. That is my wife and our oldest daughter, Ariana.
Give a wave, give a wave.
That's our oldest daughter, Ariana, and they both hate attention. So so we are parents to two children, Ariana and Michaela. But prior to me meeting her and us starting a family together, I grew up in the city of Miami.